Ladies and gentlemen, I am here to announce that Completely Machinima will be discussing Machinima films, my favorite part of the show, along with my good friends, Tracy Harwood, Phil Rice, and Damien Valentine. A core of professionals and crazy people who have some of the best films we've ever had in our lineup. I kid you not. We'll be discussing them one by one and sharing our thoughts and ideas about them. One note, next month, we're going to be starting to examine each film individually. So there'll be one episode per film. But in this one, we're going to give you the whole hog. CompletelyMachinima.com is where you'll get the notes. And let's start off with Tracy. You have an excellent and interesting film you found for us. What is it?
Yes, well, okay. So I have picked this month a film called The Cloud Racer by Impossible Objects. It's made in Unreal Engine 5 and it was released on the 15th of August, about a week ago, as we're talking. And I picked this for a number of reasons, really. First, the film's director is a guy called Joe Sills, who won John McInnes's real-time movie contest last year with a film called The Nemesis, which we talked very briefly about in the interview with John a couple of months ago. And Joe, plus a couple of the team that have worked on this film, are also judges of this year's movie contest too, which you can also find on our website. So Joe and his team are clearly Unreal Engine specialists, and this is really quite an exemplar of their talent working with that toolset. And I'd say particularly in building the world that they've used here for this particular story, which is basically a derelict Los Angeles set in 2055. Second, the studio took an interesting approach to releasing the film, which other creators might want to take note of. First of all, it was exclusively released through a website called Short of the Week, where it was reviewed by their curator. And then a week or so later, it was premiered on the studio's own website with a much higher res version. And in fact, actually, I'd recommend you look at the higher res version than the one on Short of the Week. But nonetheless, I put a link to both the Short of the Week version and the studio's website, so that you can have a look at both of those if you wish. The Short of the Week release is kind of an interesting approach because it's clearly bringing the content, new content, to a wider audience. So it's definitely something I think you should consider in thinking about when you release new films. Now, let me talk about the film itself. It's a story about a young man and his mechanic father taking part as underdogs in a futuristic racecraft competition. It's set in Los Angeles, which has become what the story describes as a ghost city. It's derelict, it's heavily polluted, and it's dangerous. The story has shades for me of Anakin's pod race in Star Wars Phantom Menace, and also Top Gun's Maverick character from the 1980s version of the film, not the most recent version, mixed with a little bit of Chris Pratt humor, I think. The story includes references to contemporary Formula One, or maybe you'd call it Indy 500 racing hype, including down to the sponsors and names of the drivers. So you see Sony, Red Bull, Samsung, alongside SpaceX, which is a bit of an interesting one. And you also hear mention of Amazon, Uber, and Honda. So there's this kind of humorous undertone and a fair bit of, I'd say, speculative and gratuitous commercialization in this too. It didn't bother me that much, but I can imagine that it might bother others in terms of that advertising side of things. Now, what I liked about the film was the relationship between the father and son character, and how the son's relationship developed alongside the other racers as this story progressed. A little bit like we see really in the media portrayal of F1 races and backchat between racers themselves. For a short of about 10 minutes, there are surprisingly quite a few characters in this, and I would say that not all of them were needed, because the racing for me did drag on a little bit too much, although there were quite a few of the events in the race itself to sort of carry it through. And then there's a point in it at which you realize the story is going somewhere rather unexpected, when this kind of mystery woman appears in the last couple of minutes. So I won't spoil that for our followers. There were a couple of technical things that I liked less, and a couple of things that I really liked. What I liked less was the shininess of the craft, in contrast to the dirtiness of the scene. In some shots, you could see that the craft were meant to be a bit battered, but they seemed a bit too plastic, which became quite noticeable during the race. Then there was this gratuitous flying bug, which did absolutely nothing for me at all. And finally, whilst I think mocap is clearly coming on amazingly well, I think what I didn't like so much really was the meta-human lips and teeth, and I think I'm noticing these more and more in the various kind of works we're seeing, and this film, because they just sort of hit me in the face so much. They looked just like a mouthful of cheap dentures, and I kind of started to fixate a little bit on them, and I don't think that's a fair comment really on the film. It's not really criticism of the film, but I think it's one of the things that the meta-human folks need to sort of look at a little bit. What impressed me most about it was the sound design, soundscape, the voice acting, the editing was really well done. From the engines of the craft to the commentator in the background, to the different tones that were represented where the speaker was in the shot. I loved all that. And of course the city design itself, including the smog or fog, it was incredibly well detailed. What did you guys think?
I'll start with my criticism, which was the camera moves a lot, and with the race and some of the more action-packed scenes, that's completely makes sense. But there's times when the characters, more towards the beginning before the race starts, and the characters are talking, but the camera is kind of moving really fast and a little bit too excessively to the point where
Exactly.
yeah, that made it hard to watch that bit when you don't need it. Moving a little bit's fine, but when it's going all over the place, it's like no, too much. But I really enjoyed the film. Apart from that, that's one of those things that stood out to me as a little niggle. But the film itself was so well made that I hope for the next, whatever they make next, I hope they tone down that camera work just a bit, because every other film you can see they put so much into it, and it makes me want to know what they're going to do next. And they also, one of the other things that really stood out to me, which is something really hard to pull off with Machinima, is the speed of the race. And what I mean is, if you're using a game, there's a point where, especially like a racing game or a flying game, if you make the vehicles realistically fast, they're very hard to control for the player. So you kind of have to get that balance from the gameplay perspective. But if you're using it to make a film, those vehicles are not going to move as fast as you'd want them to move. But in this, you kind of feel like they're moving at the speed they should be. And I really appreciate that doing that manually must have been a lot of work, and that they really successfully pulled that off. So I thought it was an excellent film, and probably my favorite pick of the month.
Yeah, it makes me wonder, Damien, your comment was like the first comment I was going to make.
Sorry.
It made me wonder. No, it's okay. Like what I found myself wondering, what's the budget of this film that they could afford to give the camera operator this much cocaine? Because I've never worked on that kind of budget film before. But yeah, okay, I'm dating myself here a lot, but in the US, there was a TV show in the late 80s or early 90s called NYPD Blue.
Oh yeah.
Which was infamous for a few reasons. One of which was, I think it was the first one to use several of George Carlin's words that you can't say on television on TV for the first time, and they got away with it somehow. Very excellent acting as well, but also that's really when the camera never really stays still thing started. And it was jarring to most people who saw it. It was like, what's going on here? It's very unsettling. But there's a subtlety to it. I don't know there's probably a name for the technique. I'm not a camera operator, so I don't know. but you can overdo it. And the thing that I learned about that technique from watching that show and then the shows that follow is that, yeah, it's the degree of movement, it's influencing the emotion and intensity of the scenes. So when there's quick movements or a lot of movements, there's something you're supposed to feel chaotic. It kind of plays with your emotions as a viewer the same way that musical score can do, especially when it's really cliched. You know, it's telling you how to feel. And Ricky, you and I have talked about that in the past, that kind of annoys you when you wake up and realize a score is just doing that. It's just trying to manipulate deliberately instead of just being there.
Yep.
And in this one, in those early scenes of this, it was moving like it's an action shot. And the same camera technique was being used in the action shots, and it worked. Like it was acceptable. But during those dialogue shots, it took me out of it. It didn't really make any sense. But barring that, I think the only areas where this film was overall extraordinary, the world building, like you mentioned, Tracy, just delicious. These big wide shots of just this, I mean, so much time must have gone into constructing that. Something that jumped out to me was facial expressions. There were certain facial expressions, especially with the father and the son. There was one where the son kind of smirked at his dad, and just, you don't see that. You see that from a good actor. You don't see that in animation. There was a subtlety there that just, those little back and forths between them and the little expressions, particularly on this part of the face, because you're right, Tracy, down here, maybe have the lips touch on M's a little more or something, you know. It is, mouthful of dentures was the perfect description. That's not their fault. I think it's a flaw of the tech. But in the upper face, my goodness, I don't know how they did that, if that was a mocap thing or if it was tweaked, but just some really interesting facial expressions that are not typical out of the box slider stuff. It was really well tailored. And I think that the father-son relationships in terms of storytelling, you figure there's really only, this thing's only 10 minutes long, and there's really only a few minutes of dialogue between them, and yet you get this sense of this larger, longer relationship, like very believable father-son banter, and like you said, Tracy, some of the racing banter that is typical. So that was wonderfully done. I think the areas where it suffered are the areas where it's just stuff that's really hard to do. I mean, it's ambitious. It's really hard to do a race. The pod racing thing, Tracy, was exactly the exact sequence that I thought of when I watched this. And much as, you know, the rest of that film, that Star Wars film doesn't really excite me, that scene, that sequence, that racing sequence was masterful.
Yeah.
And the reason is because each ship had a personality. It had its own sound. Every engine was unique, and you knew what. Remember that one ship, Damien? We'd never heard that sound in the Star Wars universe, but there was one ship that did that kind of popping sound. And then Anakin's ship had a totally different sound, and all the ships had personalities based on their sound. In this one, there wasn't much distinction there. So while that's not a failure, it's something that would have, I think, enhanced the, okay, what's going on here? The other part is when filming a race is so challenging because you have to give, you know, if you've got two characters walking through a hangar, it's very easy through the right angle choices, through an establishing shot, for all this, to give the viewer a sense of the space, and you're comfortable with, okay, so I get a feeling of where they are. And on a race, it's moving so fast and going through all these different terrains that there's this real disorientation that's very, very, very easy to have come over the viewer. And that's what I was really wrestling with, is I just couldn't feel comfortable knowing what's the path. And breaking down and analyzing the pod racing scene to determine what they did to where you don't feel that way about the pod race, even though it was a bigger course and through weirder terrain. And yet maybe it's because they did multiple laps. Damien, you might have thoughts on that. Maybe the multiple laps is why they were able to give you a sense of where they are on the course, who's ahead of who at what point. That's all about shot selection and editing. And it is, I'm not criticizing it in this film because it is extraordinarily difficult to do. You know, it's way beyond the normal stuff you have to do in cinematography to give that sense of space, establishing shot, and then this shot and a mix of wides and close-ups and all that. That already is masterful. It takes years, I think, to master. But when you're on a car chase, or in this case, a race, it's infinitely more difficult to do. I think they did a very decent job of something that, frankly, there's only a tiny tier of professionals who can do it well. And I'm talking about like Hollywood type movies. Not everybody can do that. It's a very unique craft. So the fact that they even reached for it is admirable and awesome. And I look forward to watching more from these guys for sure. And I hope that I couldn't tell from this if this is an actual chapter 1 of X chapters, Tracy, or
it looks like it. It definitely
does look like it.
I
Yeah.
hope it is.
I would
Yeah.
definitely watch more of this world because it's
Me
interesting
too.
enough.
Yeah.
So again, the kinds of criticisms that I'm doing here are like we're on Siskel and Ebert and I'm picking apart real professionals or something. I recognize that, but maybe that in itself is the biggest compliment I could give the film, is that that's what I ended up focusing on, was these things that only elite professionals can pull off anyway. And here these guys tried it and did it in a very competent way. So pretty neat stuff. I don't know anything about their background, Tracy. You may have read up on it, but very, very impressive and a lot to like here for sure.
Mhm.
Wow, Phil, that was really quite a solo. You just did.
Sorry.
Wonderful. No, don't be sorry. It was fantastic. I love to listen to you riff on it. There's little I can add to it because all of you hit on the things that I was thinking about. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the writing and the quality of the film, world making. Jason Sonti, the Short of the Week curator, talked about this, called it a sci-fi proof of concept short, heavily indebted to underdog sports films, cinematic aviation spectacles, and old school chase filmmaking.
Mhm.
He said it's a pleasing amalgam of forward-looking futurism and nostalgia. I agree with all of those, and I think that's right, although I'm not sure what proof of concept means. Does that sort of decry the quality of the film because it's not a film, it's a proof of concept? I don't know. It's strange
Yeah, I
wording.
don't
in
understand that
there.
either.
Yeah. I did really enjoy the performances and the soundscape, just like you talked about. The teeth in the mouth things, even though I noticed it didn't bother me that much as it bothered you guys. It's clear this is clearly a group of filmmakers who know what they're doing and know what they want to do and achieved it. I think the problem with you articulated flawlessly in the chase sequence. You're disoriented as to who's where and where is our hero and what they're doing there. I think that was sort of the low part of the film. They could have spent more time editing it more clearly and deciding I think one of the problems was there too many wide shots that included too many crafts in them, so you couldn't make a distinction. That sound distinction with engines would have helped with that clarification in that. So that's perfect. I enjoyed the film very much, though. And I want to point out before I finish, because I want to bring this up in the subsequent film that we're going to talk about, the idea of sentiment. The father-son relationship with the mother is a sentimental approach to story. Now, I generally don't like sentiment, but sentiment I've discovered as I've gotten older, it can still have a powerful effect when used in certain ways.
Yes.
You talked earlier off camera, Phil, about how you always cry when father takes off the mask in the Star Wars and says, "I am your father, Luke." Well, that's a bit of sentiment there, but sometimes it just really grabs your heart, certain kinds of sentiment. The sentiment in this film was perfectly fine. I understood it, but it limited the story a bit in terms, because you knew how it was going to turn out. You know what I mean? There was no suspense. Of course he's going to win the race because the mother is dead and he's got a father who's working for him. That's how those sort of sentimental stories work. If you lessen the sentiment, you create more suspense. So I think that could have benefited by perhaps adjusting that sentimental aspect. But keep in mind the fact that this is a sentimental theme, because later we're going to see two other films that use sentiment in entirely different ways. And I'd like to talk about it then. But thank you guys very much for really excellent commentary on this great film. Damien, you have a very unusual pick that's completely out of the wheel well for the kinds of film you choose. And I'd just like to say that the Lord Inquisitor is the name of the film. It has a prologue by Erasmus Brodel. It was directed by Erasmus Brodel. It was designed by Erasmus Brodel. It was overly produced by Erasmus Brodel with a production content and concept by Erasmus Brodel. So what do you have to say about the film?
Well, we know who made it.
Yeah.
This is before I hadn't started to think about what am I going to choose this month, and one of my friends actually sent this to me and said, "Isn't this real-time animation the kind of stuff that you do?" So I watched it. I thought it is, but I don't know what it was made with, and that's kind of stood out to me to start with, because you watch Machinima and you don't know what it's made with. You try and work out, is it made with The Sims or Unreal or whatever. It's just not like an unconscious thing, and I couldn't figure it out. And I got into it and I thought they actually did a really good job with a lot of this stuff. Like the animation, the character animation is really good. It looks a little bit, something about the rendering looks a little bit older. So I was trying to work out, is it something, an older version of iClone that I don't know about or something? I don't know. And I thought, well, they put a lot of work into this, and it's basically based on the world of Warhammer 40K, which I don't know too much about myself. But obviously, this is someone who knows that world really well to create this story, and they started doing things in it that you don't see a lot in, because it's obviously not made with the game. I figured that out as I was watching it, and I thought this is made with something like iClone. It wasn't made with Movie Storm, obviously, but something that you can get manual control over everything, and you start having crowds with thousands of people walking through the streets. What can you use to make that? And so I watched it, I enjoyed it, I liked the story and the way that the characters are animated, all the stuff I've already said. So I looked at the behind the scenes, and there's some behind the scenes videos. I don't really say too much about what they use, but it turns out to be Blender. And I think it's the real-time engine.
Blender, really?
Yeah.
Wow.
The real-time engine of Blender that they released however many years ago it was, and I haven't actually seen anything like this made. I've seen test projects that we've lamented on before. People do tutorials and test projects, they don't actually make a real film.
Yeah.
And so this is the first time that I'd seen something. This is going to be my pick for the month. So what did you guys think of it?
Well, it was I'm very surprised that it was a Blender production. It was certainly beautiful. It definitely in the epic style, with huge depictions of massive amounts of people and engines and faces and everything. I found it, although I enjoyed it, I have to say that, and also the work put into it was significant, especially since it was in Blender. There's a lot of work that you have to do in order to get that look. The voice acting was very good. However, I was troubled a bit by a certain amount of pretentiousness to the film. I satirized the fact that the director put the credits for himself excessively. I think there's like 45 seconds of credits at the beginning, which tipped me into the idea that this is going to be a big film, in contrast to the other films that we're looking at, when this didn't fare as well, because it tends to, these kinds of films, these epic films in the style of Game of Thrones, tend to emphasize the villains. All of the villains are the protagonist instead of being the antagonists in it. And the smarminess of the acting, although it was good, it was very typical for that kind of thing. Any competent actor could do that sort of, yeah, now you're going to die, that kind of thing. That kept me from and because it's of the epic quality, it distanced me. I couldn't get involved in the story or give a damn about any of the characters. So as a spectacle, I thought it was really well done. Although I think it could have had a bit more sound design in the film, but I was always kept at a distance from it. And that's what bothered me about the film. But overall, I enjoyed it. And I applaud the filmmakers for the amount of work they put into it.
The world building aspect visually was really impressive. The scale of things, and like you said, Damien, with all the large groups of characters moving and big architecture and all of that. I don't know anything at all about Warhammer 40K?
Yeah.
No, I haven't a clue. And to the film's credit, I didn't need to get what was generally going on, some kind of coup, basically, I think. The overall vibe of those large scenes and the military parade and all of that really reminded me stylistically of some of the Final Fantasy cinematics from 15, 20 years ago, back when the cinematic was this rich, beautifully animated, and then the game was the Sims 1 graphics, but those cinematics were just so good, they told their own story, and there's actually one of those Final Fantasy games, 7 or 8, I think, had a big parade scene, and just they achieved that very well, of this sense of just real scale. And even though I didn't know who any of the people were, I didn't really have to for this. I didn't think about it when watching it, but Ricky, when you were talking, it did strike me that there was something bugging me. And that is, I'm not sure I can identify any protagonist in this piece. There's antagonist's goons, and victim. I mean, you can't call the chancellor or whoever that was just basically just getting kicked around. He's not the protagonist. There's nothing about him that made me want to root for him. The best that I could say emotionally that it brought out was, these guys are bullying him, but in terms of, well, it left open this sense of, well, maybe he's corrupt, I mean, these guys are clearly not the good guys, but maybe this guy's corrupt and is getting what he deserves. And there was nothing to really contradict that in what we saw, just this sense of, well, he's helpless in the face of them, but that doesn't mean that he's, someone we should root to be saved. So there was that ambiguity there, and lack of anybody to really latch onto, because I think the character that was characterized most strongly, I don't have my thesaurus handy, was somebody really, really, really unlikable. Probably the best voice actor of the piece, the main dude, I don't know what his name is. He had the strongest voice performance. It's a little bit, some of the lines were a little bit cliched, but he's the one you got the strongest sense of. And also this sense of, I don't like this guy. I don't think he's out for his own power, it seems. He's overthrowing someone, but I don't think whatever's on the other side of that overthrow is going to be good for anybody. And yeah, that's a hard, ultimately, I've watched lots of villain-centric TV and movies, especially over the last 15, 20 years. Everybody has, because it's so widely done now, and almost every major movie star has played a bad guy in the anti-hero role. We're used to it, So anyway, some impressive stuff visually. Again, some stuff going on with the lip sync that's just not quite perfect. And I always feel weird criticizing that because I grew up watching Speed Racer, which has like 3 phonemes, including closed mouth, and ooh, that's it. And it didn't bug me. Speed Racer kicked ass, so
yeah.
And the early movies that I made were just, if there was any lip sync at all, it was pathetic. Or it was, my most recent movie, it's what's called bullshit lip syncing, which is get this character to say something and then try to get your audio to line up with it, with mixed results, and here I am criticizing somebody, something that at least has, you get the gist of what they're saying, but the lips maybe don't bend perfectly. And so what, I'm going to bitch about that? No.
Yeah.
But honestly, again, please choose to take that as a compliment. You're operating at a certain level now where, those are the imperfections that stand out, is stuff that was impossible to achieve when Machinima began. And that's where we are now. So that's exciting. I'm not nearly as excited about the world built in this film as I am with the one in Cloud Racer. I don't think it's quite as compelling. And again, mainly because in Cloud Racer, at least you knew where characters stood, and okay, if nothing else, let's hope for the best for this father-son. Let's assume that they're decent people and hope for the best for them. And my search came up wanting for anybody that not to just bring despair in this one.
Yeah. Well, you know what? I thought, given its age, I was stunned to see how beautiful the aesthetic detail was in the environment, the lighting, the contrast, the models, that gold lion, unbelievable. The gold lion, I could not believe the beauty of that. That was stunning. The music also for me was really well done. Great drama. A really good fit for the story, if
it
not
did fit.
But it for me, it was a better fit than the dialogue. And frankly, I expected something really sinister to happen for the story itself to deliver against the quality of the visuals.
Sinister, or at least a little surprising.
Something.
Yeah.
But it actually fell flat for me.
Yeah.
I agree with you all. Actually, it didn't deliver on the dialogue, and then the lip sync was not great. But you know what? I think our expectations have moved on so much in the last couple of years. Bearing in mind, this was 2016. This was released 2016, so it's quite a few years old.
Right.
So, but again, it wasn't too bad, but it wasn't brilliant. And I kind of picked up on one person that commented on the video, and they said, well, dialogue 5 out of 10, lip syncing 3 out of 10, aesthetics 40,000 out of 10. And I thought that
comment.
I thought that was spot on. Actually, I really liked that. Now, what really impressed me about it was the, irrespective of the comments on the detail of it, it was the energy that went into the project. And I looked at some of the other videos by this creator, and it's very evident that it was a passion project. Fan support was what led this project to get off the ground, and that's mainly because the publisher prohibited the team from making any money at all out of the film itself. That's why you get all these credits in it.
I see.
So he was really making a really, I think he made a very strong point. That's what you get most strongly out of it. And yet in actual fact, it turns out it was the only fan project for Warhammer 40,000, which was supported by Games Workshop, which is the publisher. So what's interesting, I think, was how the project exploded from what they intended to be an 8-minute version to a full 40-minute film based on the vision and the quality of the work for how this kind of creator started to pull it all together. And in that process, what he managed to do was bring in what he called a crack team of creatives. They're professional actors, voice actors, and actually the story writer, as far as I can see, it was basically co-produced by a guy called Aaron Dembski Bowden, who is a New York best-selling novelist. And the music composer was a guy called Adam Harvey, who also composed the music for the official Warhammer Ultramarines movie, which starred William Hurt and Terence Stamp. But I have to say, I couldn't actually find the full film for Lord Inquisitor. I don't know where it is. I don't know why it's, if there is a 40-minute version, I don't know what happened to this. So it's basically just a taster, a prologue, or what I basically describe as an extended trailer. And what seems to me the development of just one lead character in the story, who is supposedly a bad guy, I think. So I think what I would comment on this, though, mostly is that what it does show is the promise of game-based storytelling in the way that it was developed. And it's actually a perfect illustration, I think, in terms of what happened, why the publisher, the game developer, wouldn't allow it to generate money. It's a perfect example of why platforms such as Unreal Engine 5 are now the go-to platform. Because if you can get a whole bunch of professionals together to create something like this, why wouldn't they do it for money?
Yeah.
And for a project of this quality to take what seems to have been like 5 or 6 years in the making, to get absolutely nothing out of it, I think is shameful. Shameful.
Yeah.
It's soul crushing. Yeah.
I think it's inappropriate. And I have to say, there's something like 7.5 million views on YouTube for this as well. But I don't know if you notice, there's no advertising over it. None whatsoever. And that's got to be to do with the limitations that the publisher put over it.
Right.
So overall, I'd say it's a really good pick, and it illustrates a lot of the challenges that Machinima has faced over the years. But I did enjoy it, and I think it's a great example of what it is, and of its time. And thank goodness for something like Unreal Engine 5 now, because you'd never make those decisions to make it in the way that they did. Again, I suspect.
Really good points, Tracy. Really good points. It occurred to me as you were all talking about the film that this might be the Machinima equivalent of heavy metal music.
Yeah.
Where it's really a mood as opposed to a story. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. That 7 million people are all going, yeah, banging their heads, go, yeah. As opposed to thinking of, you need to have a protagonist and antagonist and all that stuff, And it also makes a lot of sense that thinking of it as an extended trailer gives a perspective into why there isn't any organized plot in it, as opposed to just a piece. Well said, Tracy. Thank you.
But I wonder where the 40-minute version of it is, because I just couldn't find it. So Damien,
if anybody listening and are watching this podcast has any idea where this 40-minute version is, please let us know. Give us
I'd watch it.
Me too.
Okay, we come to a very interesting film from you, Phil. Tell us about it.
This is Person 2184 by one of Machinima's founding fathers, let's say, Friedrich Kirschner, who is an artist and photographer and all around. He's a technical wizard, amazing guy. I actually don't know when this was released. Tracy will probably be able to spot it, but it's early 2000s. It was made with Unreal Tournament 2004. And it was part of a series that was intended to be 3 films. I think he only made 2 of the 3. The second one was called The Photographer. Friedrich Kirschner, you may be aware of from, I think, the film of his that probably got the most attention, which was called The Journey or Journey. I can't remember if it has the definite article on there.
I think it's The Journey.
Okay. And basically, I found the original upload of his film, but then also in the search results, found this one that was just uploaded days ago. And the visual quality, it's a different render, not just a different upload. It's a different render of that film, which brings to me the part of this film that to me is the most extraordinary and probably something that I guess is technically lost now in terms of how Machinima was made. This was kind of the end of that era where Machinima was not something that you rendered out pieces of footage in real time and then bring them into a non-linear video editor and do post-production and all that and distribute it as a video. This was never during its during the time around its release, it was never released as a video, or not, that wasn't the primary way that you were to consume it. It was distributed as an executable, as essentially almost like a mod for UT 2004, that you would load this into the game and it would play back exactly as you see it in this video within the game engine using your 3D card. That's the way that Machinima began originally, because there was no YouTube and video was just too heavy a file to distribute, and it took way too long to render on the PCs back then. So it just wasn't the way it was done. But dating all the way back to the 80s, you have the demo scene where basically the video production was a program that would run and use the computer's graphics card to display something on the screen. And so Friedrich was aware of and kind of, in a way, came from that tradition. But what's unique about his work is that it doesn't look anything like the game at all.
Yeah, no.
If I'm not mistaken, every single piece of artwork, every texture, every character, when you see it, you'll see why I'm air quoting character, because it doesn't look like character models of the time. The way that he handled the animation of them, very interesting. But my understanding is he's a photographer. He took pictures of and created all these graphics and assembled this film. And it's running in that game engine, but it's using almost exclusively, or maybe exclusively, original image assets. And the effect is extraordinary. I don't know who composed the music. I can't remember, but it's not like a known or popular piece. It's something that probably, knowing him, he had a friend who did that, or maybe he even does it himself. It would not shock me. The guy is pretty amazing. So
it's original music, Phil. It's but it's not. Okay. It's not Friedrich. It's,
right.
Somebody else.
Someone else. Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, and actually, there is still a website. I believe it's person2184.com. That's the page that he's had up for 15, 16, 17 years now, where you can still download it as a mod to run in Unreal Tournament 2004. And the original, I mean, he's just kept that page up all this time.
Wow.
So it's pretty extraordinary. And apparently, the best I can guess is that somebody who is able to get UT 2004 to run on modern hardware downloaded that and ran it and rendered it freshly with the higher fidelity capture technology that you can do nowadays. And it's a noticeable difference. The fidelity of the overall image in the film is just crisp. And the prior render that I remember seeing before was a bit faded. And at the time he released it, there was a video download, and it was kind of lower fidelity. And what he would emphasize is, well, this is not at all the way you're intended to watch this. You're supposed to watch it within the engine, full screen, and this sequence of events plays out with the music and everything. So I don't know. You guys clearly had no trouble finding really compelling, recently released stuff. I just had no luck at all. And so kind of decided to look backward and came upon this film and remembered what an impression it made on me. And it and its sequel film, The Photographer, are just wholly unique, I think, in the
I'm really glad you did.
in the history of machinima.
I'd like to encourage everybody, all of you, to do that. If you can't find a film, or there's a certain film that you remember that you really like, let's add that to the group, because I think it's a really nice contrast to the other films that we have. Friedrich was one of those giants in the early machinima era. One of those people, probably the most creative filmmaker of the bunch, whereas Hugh and others were sort of recreating stories from the games. Friedrich was completely reinterpreting and in a very contemporary way. That the person of 2184 is almost like if you remember some of those early scenes in Blade Runners where they had the crowd, it's almost like the point of view of one of those people in the crowd, looking at it. It's somewhat abstracted, but there's definitely a very urban sense to it. It's exciting, it's interesting. He was just great, and he was part of a big brain drain that occurred towards the end of that era, in which Paul Marino and Friedrich and several others withdrew from the main everyday machinima creation and moved on to other things. Friedrich is still involved in real-time filmmaking. He's gone into academic teaching and demonstrating. He's still creating technology. He was an exciting person, and machinima lost a big contributor, although he's still contributing in a way, just not as directly as before. In person, 2184 was my favorite of his films. I like The Journey a lot, but this one was just so unique.
I agree completely. Yeah. The Journey's great, but this one's always been my favorite of his.
It just has a real, now, interestingly, if you look at a film that we're going to talk about in the future, Facing the Wolf, that I chose, that was Milan Machinima Festival. They oftentimes choose films that have a lot of ideas in them, sort of intellectual ideas.
Mm-hmm.
This one is a film that has a lot of ideas, but it doesn't put the ideas front and center. It puts the filmmaking front and center, and the ideas are behind it. So you can pull out things. And to me, that's a much more interesting process, because you have an emotional response to the film. This produces a kind of emotional feeling that I can't quite describe, but I re-experienced it with this new render, and I just loved it. I just think it's great. Tracy,
his films impact me the same way that good paintings do.
Yes.
It's the same, like you said, Ricky. It's the ideas are there, but not in your face. You spend time with it, and you can draw them out almost like spirits. It's a wonderful experience.
Good analogy.
Yeah, I mean, painterly that's a really good way of describing it. Actually, I also picked up on the Blade Runner-esque kind of feel to the film. I'm not really sure when this was released, because on Fauzi's Vimeo channel, this and The Photographer were released in 2008. But as you've already said, Phil, this was never intended to be released in a kind of a 2D narrative format. It was intended to be, and how he describes it. The goal of it was to present an idea of an alternative art direction. He says content and story structure being interactive and using what he described as non-interactive narrative within in a game space. So the So the whole kind of purpose of the aesthetic style of it was to be experienced within the game, and it was intended to be a mod that you played, which I think is that we've lost that in at the moment. I say at the moment because I do think people are beginning to realize that there's more to game-like experiences than we've necessarily been looking at, particularly when we talk about the adoption of things like VR. But I think nobody's really pinned down the storytelling side of that too well at the moment. There are, I think, a few interesting groups that are playing with it, but this was way ahead of its time, I think. So it's a really interesting historical piece, but one that I think will be held up as an exemplar for the way that it was created and intended to be experienced.
Yes.
As for the aesthetic style, I think what I really admired about this was the layering of video and that kind of aesthetic that he's applied, all these different what I'd say appear to be post-production techniques, but they're clearly not post-production.
Yeah.
So
almost like cutout video.
Yeah, how did he do that? I mean, that was I mean, it's actually incredible stuff.
Yeah.
And as you've already said, Phil, he was an absolutely outstanding contributor to the world of machinima and to the history of machinima,
and possibly one of the nicest people,
oh my God,
personally, that I've ever met in my entire life.
Yeah, me too.
Just a warm soul,
gentle soul.
Really, a really nice person. Yeah, he came to the European Machinima Festival in 2007. The first time I met him, he was an absolute delight. But what you can clearly see here is just how innovative his creative practice was at the time. And like I said, I'm not too sure what the date of this is. If it's 2008, I'd be very surprised if it is. It's got to be pre that.
I think it's slightly older than that. I don't think it's 2004. The game had been out for a while before he did this, but I remember talking about it when I was doing my podcast back then. So that would have been 2006, 2007.
Yeah. Well, we reviewed The Journey, which is another 2004 one that he did. Or Ben, I beg your pardon, Ben reviewed the Journey in the history episode that we just released. So we'll put a link to that in the show notes as well, so you've got that back reference, and that will link you to The Journey itself, which is another outstanding creative piece that he did.
I've learned a lot about this film just listening to you, because I didn't realize it was made to be watched in the game when I watched it. And so thinking back, like you said, Tracy, how did he pull off these things that look like post-production effects in the game? Because I haven't used that version of Unreal, so but what I know about it, I've never seen anything like that done in any game made with that engine, so I don't know how he did it. But
he was very smart.
Two words that come to mind is urban grunge. It's what you imagine a dark, dirty, probably crime-filled city would be like, and this video captures that atmosphere perfectly. And you guys have kind of left me struggling what to say, because you've already said I got the same Blade Runner vibes from it as well, and it was a really excellent film. And actually, another part of it's not necessarily directly this film, that maybe start thinking about it. These films that were made to be watched in the engine, there's kind of this element. That's where Machinima started. And then you got this thing where the transition was over to capturing the footage from the game, and now you've got platforms like iClone and so on. So there's a bit in the middle where you cannot change the film. So anything made by that, if you want to upscale it or render it again, you have to make the thing from scratch. But this, because it's been released again by running through the game engine again, the high resolution, better video capture technology, you get a much higher quality copy than the video version that was made available now back then. And of course you can do that in iClone now. You can load up an old iClone project and render it again with the latest graphical enhancements. But there's this bit in the middle where that can never happen. And so it's interesting. I'm kind of wondering, what about these other old Machinima projects that were made to be run in the game that they were made in? You could do the same thing with them. Well, I mean, I'd hope that the original creator would do it, not someone else. Could play it out again, capture it at a much higher resolution, maybe even a modded version of the game engine or a newer version of the game engine to add even more enhancements to it if they want to, and then release this old film, but make it more accessible to newer audiences in a high resolution.
I think Ben has actually done some of that, Ben Grucey,
Okay.
especially with some of the really original, Quake 1 Machinima. He still will watch them that way. I just don't think he's ever actually, he doesn't feel confident he would know how to render it out properly and put it up, or maybe that even has the right to. But yeah, that is very possible. The one last thing I'll mention about this film is that Friedrich himself is actually in the film.
Yes,
he is one of the faces, and if you know what he looks like, maybe we can find a picture, Tracy, from Machinima Europe 2007. There's that one photo of where he's like right out in front.
Absolutely.
You see the smile on that face there. You'll see he's the face that's kind of popping above the crowd in a couple of the different scenes. It always cracked me up that he put himself in there. I think in The Photographer, he is also in that one as well. Maybe it doesn't emphasize his face quite as much, but he's there. I think the character holding the camera.
Yeah.
That's cool. There's a little bit right in the middle where the character of person 2184 has a repeating gesture on their face.
Yeah.
And it perfectly exemplifies the neurotic grunge thing that you were talking about, Damien. You get the feeling that this kind of neurotic person going down the street, they're very connected to modernism and German expressionism, the notion of the person in the city where the city is a kind of monster and the person is just terrified of everything. It was just so beautiful. Such a great film.
It's amazing too that, so this was made, sometime between 2004 and 2008. And yet there's nothing about, if you look at an in-game Machinima made in that same time period, you can tell, that's older hardware. It's the stylistic choice he made is not one bound to a particular date on the calendar. Like it works now. If someone made this now, no one would be surprised that it was made now.
Yeah.
And that to me is where his sensibility as an artist really came through, because that's what they do. It's nobody looks at you can't look at a painting. Okay, you can, based on how it was painted. You could probably go, oh, well, that's from this era of painting, but I don't know. This just doesn't age for me.
Me neither.
It worked then. It works now.
Yeah.
And I think it'll work 20 years from now. It makes because
you wonder.
It's a style that transcends time, I think.
It makes you wonder what Friedrich, had he stayed into the mainstream of Machinima, would have done with Grand Theft Auto. How he would have moved with that, or the Unity game engine, or the contemporary version of Unreal.
Yeah.
Yes.
Fascinating stuff.
Or what he will do. Friedrich.
Come on.
Yeah.
Yes. Get on with it.
Okay. Our next film is a film that was submitted to us. Tracy, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. Yes. This has been submitted by Martin Bell. The film's called Prazinburk Ridge. And Martin created it under the studio banner of Yes Commissioner. It's been made in Unreal Engine 4, and it was released on the 27th of June this year. Now, the story is set in World War One. It's a former rugby player for Great Britain called Dougie Clark, who must rely on his rugby skills to save himself and his fellow soldiers from shot, shell, and poison gas. It's actually based on a true story, focusing on a part of the story that led to Dougie's award of the Military Medal for Bravery. And it was written, directed, and animated by Martin, based on an official biography by his brother, Stephen Bell, in a book called The Man of All Talents, The Extraordinary Life of Douglas Clark. And it includes an original score by Mike Payne. Now, Martin is not an inexperienced filmmaker. He has 15 years of animation experience and is now a film visualization supervisor and has worked on action sequences for franchises like the Jurassic World, Marvel, Fast and Furious, James Bond, and the DC Universe. His credits also include The Little Mermaid, Aladdin, 1917, and The Wheel of Time.
Yeah.
And he's been writing screenplays for years, so he's got chops. But this was a solo project which took him about 2 years to make and was completed within about 8 months of him having picked up Unreal Engine 4. He'd never used it before. He says he had a couple of previous edits ready to go in autumn 2020, but he realized the project had become too ambitious to complete alone, although he then couldn't get an animator or an animation team together that he wanted to help him. So he tried to do it himself. What he did is he scaled back some of the areas that he'd originally wanted to do and then applied a technique that he felt would hide some of his artistic weaknesses and created a workflow that would help him cut a few corners. And I have to say, from my point of view, this is an incredibly well crafted film, as you might expect. It's very moving and it's very detailed. Or it is, at least, I think, in the first part of the film. I think what you can see here is, I think for me, the story certainly ran out of steam a little bit towards the end. And certainly what he's using at the end is some jumps forward, which are clearly quite a good way to move it along and hit some of the key points that you kind of want to make in the storytelling. And it's, you know, it's a story of a regaled war survivor who used his sports training skills to save his fellow soldiers during a time of intense fighting. The style that he's used, the effects that is applied to this really suits the story. I think it's what I would describe as a really intense vignette of this man's experience. It's really harrowing stuff. Quite frankly, I don't think you'd want more detail than what has been presented in this, or at least if you had more detail, I don't think it would necessarily add more to what is already there. And the sound design is brilliant. It's detailed, it's very richly layered. And what I really like as well is these kind of West Yorkshire accents that have been applied. They're bang on in terms of accent. And although it was a solo production, Martin is very clear that its creation has been a collaborative process. And of course, the film is actually now part of the materials telling the story of this man's life too, because it's being used as part of an exhibition about Clark in Huddersfield when he played sport. And so those of you who are interested, I think what we'll do is also put a link to the book, which was written by his brother, so that you can find out more should you want to. What did you guys think?
You mentioned that he worked on 1917, and that's one of the films that's coming to mind as I was watching this. It's very harrowing and claustrophobic. This film we're talking about now, and the darkness in it, it makes you feel really shut in. When you've got all the explosions and fighting going on around you, you really feel what he must have been. Well, you know, that you get that sense of you're trapped in this dangerous place. Any moment you could be next to go. And I think the nighttime setting was, you know, really helped with that. And I also really like the stylized look to it as well. As we were just talking about films that don't age so well because of the stylized choice, this is one that I think if you watch it in 20 years, it won't look as dated as something else made with the same engine, because it's got that stylized look, which I think helps separate it from, you know, the way that engine would typically look. and I think that was an excellent choice. It's nice to know that it's being used to tell this film as part of an exhibition to tell the story about this guy who, was fighting in the war back then, and yeah, I think it's an excellent film.
Yeah, it's almost a cell shaded look, isn't it?
Yeah.
Damien?
Yes.
Maybe not quite as limiting as that, but I loved this. I absolutely loved it. The story is, this is definitely the one Ricky wanted to talk about with sentimental stories, so I'm going to leave that to him. But in terms of the telling, I can't find anything wrong with it. It's just exceptionally well done. And, we talked with Cloud Racer about the challenge of sequencing your shots to prevent disorientation. So at least you have a general idea of where you are. And this is textbook, perfect execution of that. Like, there is no moment in this story where you don't have enough of a sense of where you are and who it is you're following. To me, I think this was done perfectly in that regard. And the amount of experience that you said that Martin has as a filmmaker, to me, that's where that really shines, is the way in which the scenes and the shots were put together. It's got that pro touch. It's really, 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 really good. We could probably spend an hour just if we wanted to dissect why did that work so well? What specifically did he choose? But we don't have an hour for that, so I won't do that. But I loved it. I loved the sound. I think the music fit perfectly. And I don't know. You mentioned, Tracy, that you felt like the story ran out of steam. I didn't get that off of it.
I thought it jumped too much. I thought I got really into the detail. The blood spatter at that that early point, and it really took me on that journey of how horrific it must have been at Passchendaele.
Yeah,
basically.
Yeah.
Really kind of
were you familiar with the protagonist's story at all before seeing this?
No, but then I went and read a bit about it, and I realized what he'd done was kind of picked one part that's particularly well documented and well remembered.
Yeah, I don't know why it didn't feel over compressed story.
No, it
timeline wise to me, and
it didn't to me either. But I did.
There's a little surprise. There's a little surprise at the end too. For me, it was quite a surprise right at the very end, just done with text that I won't give away, but it's it's worth watching all the way. I mean, I gasped because I thought I understood what I had just seen, and then they gave a little detail there at the end that was just great. So I like any film that can do that to me. It's hard to surprise modern jaded eyes, So anyway, I loved it, but I'm interested to hear what you think, Ricky.
Well, World War I is depicted often, interestingly enough, in Machinima. Over the years, all of us have watched Machinima films, and World War I comes up in a variety of ways. But I don't think I've ever seen a more effective Machinima film on World War I, a more believable one. And that's strange, because even though the film is stylized and cell shaded, it actually seems more realistic.
Yes.
Which harkens back to the idea that animation, cartoons, machinima can actually, with its stylization, tell a story that is more impactful than if you got Steven Spielberg and $100 million worth of extras and special effects. Because what it does is I think, and is my theory, it allows you to fill in the blanks with your imagination. It gives you just enough to show what it was like, but you put in all of that rest that Steven Spielberg would show. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
And I
you
think
get the whole battle.
Yes, I think that's what I love about animation and machinima, and why I oftentimes prefer it over more realistic live action fare. And I don't think I have seen a film by a machinima filmmaker that was more effective in getting its world and story across in a way. Yes, there have been really great Machinima films that we love, but this one was almost perfect. It's just
Yeah.
so great. I didn't have the same problem you did, Tracy, but I see your point now that you mentioned that. I could see, you could see it that way. But finally, the thing I want to talk about is sentiment. Remember at the beginning, we were talking about sentiment with Cloud Racer? Whereas sentiment sort of limited the filmmaker in Cloud Racer from having a more elaborate and believable story. In this one, it didn't do that. It actually contributed to the story in a way that is, I don't know how to explain it, but it was, the sentiment endowed the story with a kind of quality that makes you feel good
Yes.
about people. Do you know what I
I'm
mean?
so glad to hear you say that. I'm so glad to hear you say that. I thought surely you were going to chew this one up for it, but you said it so perfect. It did. Somehow it enhanced it.
Yeah.
Oh,
And that sometimes sentiment can do that in a way that a more realistic film would not, you know? And it's part of the process of creating animation and 2D characters and that sort of shortened, truncated format, you know, the way he laid it out, his craft of filmmaking. And that's why I was just so moved by this film. And normally my sentiment meter just goes off the charts when that sort of stuff comes up and I detach. It's just me. That's the way I do it. But this one, I wanted to point out the sentiment sometimes can be a primary element of a film and be so effective in it. But it may feel so good about, and it, knowing, I know a lot about World War I and about that particular battle. Any old white guy in his 50s and 60s would be obsessed with that kind of stuff. You know, it's just the way it is. But I put in all of this stuff that I had in my mind and I realized, God, what a heroic choice to say, no, that's my truck. I've got to take care of it. Knowing that it could mean instant death for him. Oh my God. What a moment. What a moment. I just love this film.
I did too.
Just a second. Mr. Bell, please make more movies.
Yes.
Yeah. Brilliant.
And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen, a really nice collection of films. Now we've run a bit long in this episode. There was one more film we were going to talk about. We're going to do that in a separate episode. My choice, Facing the Wolf by Ian Douglas and Mark Coverdale, because there's a lot of things I think we need to address in that one. And it would just make this episode too long. So that's going to be our show for you today. We're going to do a separate episode next time. Please watch these movies. These are great and interesting movies. Despite our criticisms, all of them are just terrific films.
Yes.
And deserve
Top
to be
tier for sure.
watched. Check the links in our show notes. Contact us about the films. Talk at completely.machinima.com. I'm Ricky Grove, and for Tracy Harwood, Phil Rice, and Damien Valentine, that's our show today. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.